take on. It's not what I had in mind at the beginning of this decade when I stepped up to run for office in order to help my home community that was being characterized as a dying city. And it's certainly not what the pundits were looking for in January. Nobody was saying, you know, we're really waiting to see when the millennial Midwestern mayor lane is going to get filled, right? And yet the reason that I think we've been able to rise into the top tier of candidates so quickly is that this message is meaningful across the country. And the message is this: we're living in a moment of such profound and accelerating change that even now, we may well be underreacting. And I'm not just talking about the president. I'm talking about the conditions that made this presidency possible. Things like this don't just happen. A guy like this doesn't get within cheating distance of the Oval Office unless things are broken in our economy and in our political system. And if we're not paying attention to that at the deepest level and prepared to offer answers that speak to what this is going to mean for our future, then we run the risk as a party of being ignored and tuned out once again by some of the very people who have the most to lose from the current state of affairs unfolding the way that it is. Our campaign is rooted in values that I believe to be American values with progressive implications, but that are still too often talked about, as is the word values itself, sometimes associated as though it's just a conservative thing. Freedom being the classic example, and I love discussing this in the state that lives by the words live free or die. Freedom is not a conservative idea. It is an American idea. And we are living in a moment that is forcing us to recognize all of the ways in which there's a whole lot more than government that can make you unfree. And that many of the ways in which government can make you unfree are being worsened by those in charge today. I don't believe you're free if you lack access to health care. Because you can't, in the great American tradition, go start a small business if you're afraid to leave your old employer because that would mean losing your health care. We certainly know that you're not free if you do not have access to quality public education, which is why I believe we need a Secretary of Education who actually believes in public education. Women are being made less free across this country by the invasion of their reproductive rights, by often all-male votes in legislatures around the country, and a White House that is indifferent to reproductive autonomy. And I think at a moment like this, it's twice as important that men in the Democratic Party be standing up shoulder to shoulder with women who are stepping up for their rights, and we'll be there for that. That's what American freedom is about. I say this as somebody whose own personal freedom to choose my spouse exists by the grace of a single vote on the U.S. Supreme Court. So this is a time to reimagine what commitment to freedom looks like in our time and what the political consequences of that are. We're changing the conversation about freedom. We're changing the conversation about security, something that is obviously on my mind as a veteran, but also needs to be imagined in much bigger terms than the imagination of a president who thinks you can make America secure by just putting up a wall from coast to coast. Ignoring the fact that 21st century security threats include things like election security and cyber security. A response to white nationalist violence that has now claimed more lives here in recent years than Islamist terrorism. And a response to the reality that climate disruption is the security challenge of our time, nationally and globally. That's what it means to care about security in the 21st century, and we're going to deliver a different conversation about security. We're out to change the conversation about faith, and we do this very carefully and advisedly because it is to the credit of the Democratic Party that we stand for the principle that every official and candidate ought to represent people of any religion and people of no religion equally. But people who are motivated by religion when they make moral and political choices need to know that they have a choice. That being religious doesn't mean you've got to get mixed up with the sort of people who are in charge right now. Not when they're putting children in cages. Not when they are comforting the comfortable and afflicting the afflicted. At a time like this, when every faith and, frankly, every secular moral tradition tells us to approach the world with humility and decency and to concern ourselves with the well-being of the most vulnerable and the marginalized, we have a choice. And we need to remind America about that choice. And as we take these steps toward freedom, toward security, toward asserting that God doesn't belong to a political party, we are finding that we can have a unifying message that speaks to people across very different life experiences and geographies around this country. But we've got a major barrier, which is that our democracy, our democratic republic, is getting less democratic, not more. And it's why we need to undertake not only measures to deal with what I think every Democratic candidate is correctly talking about, like money in politics, and gerrymandering that has politicians picking out their voters instead of the other way around. Also things that don't get talked about nearly enough. The fact that we need to look at the very structure of our democracy, that it is fitting for a democracy to choose its national leader by just counting up all the votes and giving it to the person who got the most,
right.
at risk of sounding simple-minded, that this is generally how elections are conducted. That it would be fitting for us to make sure every U.S. citizen has full representation, which is why I'm not going to talk about D.C. statehood only when I'm in D.C., but also when I'm in places like New Hampshire. Because the exclusion of fellow Americans makes us all worse. And so we need to be prepared to talk about those fundamental conditions in our democracy that are currently twisted to where you get outcomes that are totally out of keeping with what the American people want and expect on matters from climate to immigration to gun safety. We're laying out all kinds of specific plans that help you understand what we think this looks like in practice. From a new call to national service that explains how we can also fortify our democracy through a democratic culture in which there are 1 million service opportunities a year for young people. So you don't even have to mandate it because it becomes such a norm that when you're applying for your first job or your college admissions, the first question you get is, what did you do with your year of service? And as we do that, build the kind of common experience that I had with fellow Americans of radically different political and racial backgrounds, but came to trust with my life. I want everybody to have that experience without having to go to war to get it. So we're talking about national service. We've laid out I believe, the most comprehensive plan for the empowerment of Black Americans yet delivered in the context of this campaign. Knowing that this is not only a matter of justice and restoration for Americans who have been systematically excluded from prosperity and well-being in this nation, but also that everybody is better off when we do something to show that we recognize that replacing a racist policy with a neutral policy is not going to be enough for these inequalities to wash out of the system. For the simple reason that in the same way that $1 saved compounds, so does $1 stolen. And the fact that some of the generational theft we're living with happened 100 or 200 years ago doesn't make it better, it makes it worse. And so we're looking at what we can do across home ownership, education, economic empowerment, criminal justice reform, democracy itself, every facet of American life where we are made more unequal as consequences of racism, we're going to tackle intentionally and with very specific actions. So we've been working on this for months, but today we've released the details of what we're calling the Douglas Plan. Because I want this to be as ambitious as the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe. We're going to do it right here at home. We've laid out